new design best practices for planning cloud. Gerry and I are presenting this today, and I think, Gerry, you have a presentation tomorrow as well, right?
I do. Tomorrow at 1 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Central.
Okay. So some of you probably know me. I haven't looked at the attendee list. And in the last session I looked, and some of my colleagues and friends were there. So hello, and if I don't know you, hello for the first time. I work with Gerry at Promethean Analytics. I've been working in the industry since 1996. I did work at Arbor in the 90s. I think I started with version 4 there, so a little bit later than Gerry. Went on to Hyperion and some other things, and I actually left the whole space to do a web startup with a really brilliant friend of mine who was way ahead of me technologically. Learned a lot there, and I think over time, one of my key things I always focus on is user experience. So, less is more, and doing things in a way that will be fast for what people want to do most of the time is really, really important. Gerry?
Gerry Villamil. I've been in the space. I stopped counting at 25 plus. Leave it at that. Started with Arbor in 93. The company was at that time approximately 34, 35 strong. And obviously everybody knows where Arbor took off from with Hyperion and Oracle. I've been on both sides of the table, both from a pre-sales and post-sales perspective. I've been consulting on the post-sales side for the majority of those 25 plus years. And even though I'm in management, I stay happily involved in the day-to-day development of the tool. So obviously I have a background in both on-premise of the EPM suite as well as the cloud suite. Been doing cloud more in the last 7-8 years than I've been doing on-premise, but at times some of our clients actually ask us to still do some on-premise work with the EPM stack. And that's about it.
Gerry and I compete for who can do a better Groovy or more creative things with Groovy. So I wanted to go back a little bit in time, since we're talking about design. When I started in my career, it was at the Clorox company in 1996. Things were very different, obviously. I was put in a room with 2 very large volumes of books to read, no computer in my office. So I read the Essbase Database Administrator's Guide front to back, 2,000 pages. And at the same time, they got me working on mainframe focus. I don't know if any of you have heard of these tools. If you've been around a little bit longer, for sure. A similar tool was Nomad. These are running on mainframe with these green screens or different color screens. But these tools had databases, programming languages. You could have users enter data. They had automation, and the users could run reports, and they would be given choices. You could send those reports out as a batch to people. And even you can log on from home. So what's funny is in between these tools and now, there were these client server applications, right, which took the market by storm in the late 90s. And we lost maybe a few of these that were really cool, or they became different and harder to use. But now we come back in a way full circle, and I'm sort of tickled that we're here. And so not everything is totally new, right? It's old, reinvented, and it's also much better and looks better now too, of course. Somewhere in the late 90s, we got Hyperion Planning. And I remember being an Essbase person, there was a lot of reaction that, well, with Excel and Essbase, we can do everything planning does. In fact, more. If you know VBA, gosh, we can do some really amazing things. And this thing is really simple and there's nothing to it. It doesn't do anything. And when we first started with it, Gerry, I think you remember, right? We were in a room and we decided we're going to install the on-prem for the first time, the beta version. And we just went in circles. I mean, it would install within a day or two, and then we'd try the same thing, same exact settings, same steps on a different machine, no dice. And so it was really quite difficult at first to use, but it became very popular, I think, because of the user experience, especially for planners. Right? I had a lot of the core features that we have today, but part of the design elements we're going to talk about are things extra you can do in cloud. And then one other big hitch that used to be, how do you do a proper backup and restore? This sounds like IT stuff, and most shops and consulting projects we did, we try to do this correctly, but it wasn't really done all that much or that often, and very rarely did anyone know how to restore something, right? And then just include a picture of the desktop refresh tool. I don't know if anyone remembers that, but initially they had a desktop tool to do your cube refreshes, right? So yeah, we're going to talk about EPBCS, the different versions, the design considerations for those, the frameworks, what they are, how you might use them out of the box versus how you might change them, and then a few things around Groovy and performance and data integration. So Gerry, I think you started with 2.1, right? Did I get that correct?
Oh, yes. When actually there was no 1.1 or 1.0.
Okay.
So when Arbor first rolled out Essbase, they actually started with 2. So they want to actually look like they actually had a few releases prior to it rolling out to the masses.
Got it. Yeah, Clorox, they bought the initial beta version way back when. And they had no idea what to do with it at first. We've been with Hyperion Planning from the beginning, HFM from near the beginning. And when cloud came out, we were right on that. We've learned a lot of things. We try to build applications that are easily repeatable and that have a lot of functionality out of the box. And so a lot of what we're sharing today is going to be coming from that experience and how we can get the most improvements from things, but how you can easily maintain the applications and put in your own specific customizations, right? And the end goal, one of the huge differences with cloud, as you all know, is how do you ensure that the finance team or whichever team is owning it can really own it and run it, right? And not need a lot of technical support or having to call us back as consultants, right? We'd rather help you build things and then have you know how to use them. And I think that's a huge advantage of cloud, as we all know. And Gerry?
Yeah, so nowadays, Oracle / Netsuite, for those that leverage the Netsuite flavor of PBCS or EPBCS, Oracle's tried to streamline the number of SKUs out there. So the SKUs have trimmed down to basically 2 major flavors within the Oracle side of the house. And on the NetSuite, they have 2 unique flavors that we'll actually go into. So within Oracle, they've gone through and obviously either give you the option of doing enterprise suite, where you basically have all you can eat when it comes to EPM, all the individual submodules in regards to FCCS, EPBCS, ARCS, et cetera. Or for those that don't want to have the all-you-can-eat approach, they can go with EPBCS standard, which is an extremely locked down version of EPBCS. You basically just get your basic frameworks and 1 ASO cube and 1 BSO cube. On the NetSuite side, it's actually a little bit more flexible, if you can believe it. NetSuite gives you PBCS Plus that gives you your 3 custom plan types, your ASO cubes, as well as 1 financial framework, or 1 framework, which is financials. So, and then you can also get the premium stack that's primarily targeted to obviously small middle market, but gives you the ability to have all your BSO custom plan types, your frameworks, as well as your ASO plan types. For those that have implemented the frameworks, obviously financials is quite common. We implement financials almost at probably 80–85% of our customers. We find that depending on what you implement within that stack, it's easy to consume for the for our customers, as long as you understand some of the constraints that come with financials. Workforce as well. For those that are on the Oracle side, we implement the workforce framework with a twist. So workforce comes out of the box for Oracle, in my opinion, is a bit constraining, and also doesn't quite match what comes from payroll systems. So we've gone through and built an accelerator on top of the workforce framework that is more payroll system-like, and a lot of our customers tend to enjoy that look and feel. Capital, actually, not too many of our customers have implemented Capital. It's a very simple framework, very easy to implement, but for most of our customers, it's just one of those things that always gets pushed off and they don't implement. But a very simple framework to implement. It also integrates quite well into projects. Even though projects is a very complicated framework, we have implemented it, but we've scaled it back. We don't roll everything out just because our customers tend to get overwhelmed with all the features and functions that come with projects. From an EPBCS perspective, depending on the framework, additional plan types are added for each framework. A lot of those plan types are out of the box or built for reporting. Pros and cons of that, obviously, is that you get those additional plan types, so they don't interfere with your custom plan types. The con is that they're extremely locked down. So like the reporting cube that comes with Workforce, you can't really modify that to the degree that you need to modify it. So we actually created a reporting cube that's outside of that. But the beauty of those frameworks is that you can actually leverage ASO and Smart Push. And if necessary, and we do that on all our accelerators, we use the reporting cubes extensively, and we use the frameworks primarily for planning and the reporting cubes primarily for reporting. So that allows you to actually take advantage of the best of all worlds with those frameworks. Use the frameworks for doing the heavy lifting and use the reporting cubes for doing all your reporting. And it works out quite well. One of the reasons why we actually implement the frameworks, at least a minimum of one, is that we can take advantage of Groovy. So this only works for Enterprise Suite on the Oracle side and the EPBCS Plus or EPBCS on the Netsuite side. On EPBCS standard, Oracle has done a great job to really lock it down. So you can't leverage Groovy on EPBCS standard, which is quite disappointing, to be honest. But
you get the Smart Push in ASO though, right?
You do. So anything that you can do your Smart Pushes through the forms directly into an ASO reporting cube, but you can't really optimize with Groovy. And Groovy, we use Groovy extensively within all our accelerators because it allows us to optimize the business rules if necessary. Bill?
Yeah, and then one thing we'll talk about a little later, and John Goodwin had a great blog post about how do you call a web service from a Groovy business rule. So essentially you can call a REST API call to anything you wanted, but as it turns out, you can make a call to the planning REST API. And so we'll talk about how we've done automation with that. All right, so so design things, right? Like we looked at, talked briefly about the history. We still have on-premise planning in a lot of places, or less and less. And there's a lot of things you can do to address scale. From one thing from the IT side, you know, you're always looking at equipment and how fast is your storage and all those kinds of things. And that has to be maintained and monitored. And you have to look at, you know, when your OS needs to be upgraded, maybe it goes end of life, or the machine is too old and it doesn't meet your data center requirements anymore. So all those things are in play, and they do affect performance, of course, right? But then on-premise, if you had an Essbase license as well as planning license, there's lots of things you can do with both of those together. And we've even seen people put in transparent partitions where the Essbase cube has actuals in ASO, and in on-premise planning, they do a partition to show actuals through there. So there was a lot of tricks available in on-premise, and then with automation too, using the full shell scripting that you have available. In cloud, it's a little different. So when we first started out, this was a huge concern. How do we get these cubes running fast enough, especially when they get a little bit bigger, right? And you can get creative about, what's dynamic and how do you organize your dimensions and split up cubes. But with features like smart push data maps, pushing data between plan types, having ASO cubes, getting data from BSO, smart pushes, if you haven't used them, they're really fast, especially from a form, really fast. They've done an amazing job with those. So that's where you can split up your data input versus your reporting, and have it be and look like a little bit like magic, actually. Whereas in the past, especially if we didn't use ASO on premise, if you had a bigger cube, sometimes those saves, if they had to aggregate the data a little bit, it took, it could take a little while, right? I mean, and no one wants to wait, 15 seconds seems like a lot, and I've seen things that might take a minute or two to save because that was just the reality, right? So that's a huge, huge difference. So I would recommend you going down that design path. You can enable hybrid using EPM Automate. Should you do that? If you're only using BSO for inputs, I think you should, in case you have a form that requires some aggregation or a calc potentially, then it's worth it, right? And it doesn't really cost you anything in terms of your ability to design. Now, hybrid used to be more limited on premise. There are certain things you couldn't do, and the cross dimensionals cause problems. Those have been, by and large, eliminated. In Essbase 12c, they're really, really good. So we're most of the way there, right, with cloud planning. So I'd recommend that. Should you build one cube to do it all? Should you have multiple plan types? Maybe you should create a custom plan type or two. If you don't use Groovy, I think maybe having more than one cube as a general rule might be easier. But what we'll show in a little bit later with Groovy is using the REST API within the application, you can have data and other jobs running on multiple cubes from one rule. So you can do a lot of integration stuff. Also, we talked about frameworks a little bit. We'll get into frameworks a little bit more detail. The framework give you out of the box, not only on top of the core planning dimensions, but they give you forms and custom hierarchies. I think use them as much as possible, for sure, because then the forms are all integrated with those. It just works together, right? And there are calcs associated with those. If you need to customize it, create separate things, right? Don't change the out of the box things. If you change them, then they don't get upgraded. So don't change them, okay? And then the last one is when you have forms for input, next to them, you might have a few reporting forms. Out of the box for frameworks, they're pointed to the BSO cubes. Some of them, I would recommend changing those to ASO. Now you may have to create them from scratch. Exporting the LCM and then changing re-importing can be a little messy. So that's a little bit of work. Okay, that is a little bit of work. So you're going to change the framework. Okay, we'll give you some guardrails for that. Be careful here, right? What you change then may not be upgraded. So we try to leave the framework alone as much as possible and work around it and with it. Okay. Also for moving data between the frameworks. So let's say you have your financials and you have your workforce at a much lower level of detail for employees and all the metrics and functionality. You want to be fast to move data. So you pick and choose how you'd move data with custom rules, okay? And maybe, you know, smart pushes and those levers that you have. Ultimately, what you want is when a user clicks save, you want it to be fast, right? So this is another point where you're going to have to do a little bit of work. Right? Another one that you may not be aware of, I think, Gerry, can you talk to this one, the smart list?
Sure.
We've used this quite a bit with the projects, right?
Yeah, so one of the things that you have to understand with the frameworks is, depending on the framework, you're actually limited with the number of custom dimensions that are available to you. So for example, if you are in financials, you have the ability to add up to 5 custom dimensions if you swap out, you know, products and services for something. Okay, but if you're going in and leveraging the implementing the projects framework, you only have 1 custom dimension available to you. So that's why at times with the frameworks, you have to have a little caution. You also have to understand that you're kind of limited in regards to how to go through and customize that. With that said, if you have dimensions that are more attributes of another dimension, you can actually leverage smart list as fake dimensions within that framework, and then have those smart lists push out to your ASO reporting queue as an actual dimension. So for example, within projects, if you are tracking expenses by phase, well, phase is something that you really don't want to incorporate into your base planning model, but it's primarily, you can leverage it as a smart list and then push it into your reporting cube as a dimension where you can then track expenses by phase. Same thing applies to workforce. There may be specific attributes of an employee that you want to be able to actually report against, and you leverage the smart list and push into a reporting cube. So the beauty of the smart list is it allows you to push into a reporting cube that you have 100% flexibility in the number of dimensions that you want to add in there, but it doesn't impact your performance from your BSO custom cube or BSO framework. Bill?
Okay, thank you. The next one, did a training not that long ago with the users, and one person said it took a long time, minutes, to set up my user variables. Now, in the cloud, you have not only the substitution variables that are system variables, right? You have individual user variables, and this is the same as on-premise. What we'd like to do is to set up variables that are specific to set of forms, right? So let's say your financial planning, right? Maybe the revenue side has an entity that gets carried across, right? But the expense side uses entity as well, but it's an entirely different set of members than revenue, right? So if you had one entity user variable and you were switching back between revenue planning and expense planning or reporting, you'd keep having to update that variable, and that gets very frustrating. So more is better in this one case, right? Usually I'm a less is more person almost all the time. But in this case, more is better. A longer setup initially, but then you have a much better user experience. All right, Gerry?
One of the things that you need to recognize with the frameworks is, obviously this is at the end of the day planning. So a lot of the dimensions or base dimensions are similar across all the plan types. They're required actually. But within the frameworks, the counts hierarchies are what kind of differentiates specific frameworks. So you have a specific accounts hierarchy, and then within there you'll have specific groupings of accounts that are pertinent to the financials, workforce, etc. Unfortunately, when Oracle went through, and it's not unfortunately, let me just put it this way. Oracle tried to put together a set of frameworks that can be used across all industries, all verticals, all horizontals. And they also took liberties in regards to how those frameworks will model or manage the planning or forecasting process for each one of those horizontal or vertical applications. At times, for companies that are very much in their infancy, it may not fit very well. Okay, so at times we recommend that you look at those account hierarchies with a grain of salt and then determine if you're going to actually leverage them for your reporting purposes or create your own custom hierarchy within, say, accounts or other dimensions. Same thing applies to mature industries, or mature companies that are very mature in the planning process. At times, the frameworks tend to be very rigid in how they approach the planning or forecasting process, all because the frameworks are not exactly how you plan or forecast. That doesn't mean that you can't leverage those frameworks. Leverage those frameworks to your advantage. I mean, those are additional plan types that are available to you. Just implement what you need to implement, and then leverage and then go outside of the box for your own requirements. So we'll actually go through and create additional account hierarchies to support the chart of accounts, to support the client's income statement or EBITDA reporting requirements. We can do all that within the frameworks.
Now, Gerry, if you make those changes, right, then you'll have to update the out-of-the-box forms or create copies of them.
Absolutely. Again, per Bill's earlier statement, it's recommended that you don't actually modify the existing form, but create a copy of that form and modify that. Therefore, as Oracle or NetSuite roll out enhancements or changes, the base forms haven't been changed, so those will be updated appropriately. Okay. Also, it's always best to have the original forms in there, because if you ever want to roll back, you can always go back to the original form and then create a copy from that. Okay. Let's say that you made changes and then you messed it up. So you don't want to go through and have to restore from an LCM. There are system dimensions that are added for every framework. For example, in the financial framework, you have the plan element. You don't have to actually use that name. You can actually use a different naming convention. Some of our clients use source in place of plan element, so they'll actually rename it. Another one of our clients actually refer to the plan element dimension as their management reporting dimension, because they'll do a lot of gap reporting and they'll have to take into account adjustments to get to their pro forma. So instead of creating a separate dimension, we'll actually leverage the plan element for our purposes. And then we trim it down on the reporting side. Okay. There's a lot of business rules that are out of the box. Remember that any business rule that is changed no longer gets updated. So same thing as it applies to forms, we'll always create a copy of the business rule and then make appropriate changes to that business rule. Certain frameworks have more flexibility than others. So for example, the workforce framework is extremely locked down. They take advantage of templates and a lot of Groovy. So it can be a little bit overwhelming for our clients when they're actually taking a look at the actual script that is provided for certain functions. But some of the other frameworks are a little bit more open, and you have a better idea of what's going on within those business rules. Okay, and then finally, in regards to guardrails, as you go through, as I mentioned earlier, you can always modify a form, modify a report that comes out of the box. Just make sure that you create a copy of that. Always keep your existing forms available. From a framework perspective, I always recommend simpler is better. Okay, so when you initialize your framework for the very first time, always start with the bare minimum. Okay, so you can always add to your framework. You could always add an additional configuration, but if you configure all the individual options and find out that you don't need them, you can't roll back. You have to actually go through and re-implement that LCM and then layer in all your changes. So start simple and work up. A lot of our clients, we actually start with bare minimum. We give them trending and direct input, and then as that customer matures within the framework, then we implement their driver-based planning and then add some additional features and functions as they mature with the product. Bill?
Okay. So we'll look at plan element a little bit further here. So the forms and hierarchies are designed to work out of the box. So when you do change them, you have to change the forms, right? So there's an impact there. So let's you'd want to apply your hierarchies and those as little change as possible. So it might be just the accounts, right? And everything else will flow. The counts will work, all that kind of stuff, right? So I wouldn't be afraid to do it. I think certainly with the backup and restore too, you can do a lot of things testing wise, right? But I would go ahead and like Gerry said, make a copy and then just move forward, right? The plan element example in particular that we talked about, you don't have to use it out of the box like it's intended with the framework. So out of the box, and this is an example of how you might change things. Some of the base level members are prefixed with OFS, the financials framework. And so there's load, direct input, calculated adjustment, they all add up to a total, right? And the forms use these in various ways, right? So load is intended for your system data loads. Of course, direct input is what you'd expect. Calculate is what you expect. So for most of our clients, we actually change the forms to only use load and calculated. So load would be for system data, and calculated would be for everything else, including user input. So the advantage here is you simplify your forms quite a bit in terms of how to design them and where the data is. Now this is a dense dimension, so you're not going to have block creation issues. I think, is it dense, Gerry? Yeah, it's dense, right?
No, it's not.
It's sparse.
Yeah, it's fine. But Oracle's done a great job of dealing with block creation, so you don't have any of those issues that are applied.
And then moving data from BSO to ASO, a little bit easier by using two. It lets your users adjust the data a lot easier using just those two. So in practice, we found this much easier to maintain and think about. Of course, you don't have to do it, but this is an example of how you might use an out-of-the-box configuration, but in practice, the data would be used differently. And we found that it was much easier for maintenance as well, right? And for data validation, much easier to chase it down. And then with the frameworks, some of the things we talked about already about it, using BSO to ASO and some of the optimizations. All right. Gerry?
Perfect. So let's actually kind of talk to some, as we had mentioned in the earlier slides, we have the financial statements framework. We use this extensively across all our clients. I don't think that there's been one client that we haven't actually implemented the financial statement framework. It's the easiest one out of the four, in my opinion, to implement. It's very easy for the client to actually go through and understand and interact with certain caveats. So from a pros perspective, obviously that financials framework is full featured, gives you the ability to do driver-based planning, trend-based planning, direct input, gives you the ability to go through and has a number of forms that are out of the box for both rolling forecast and regular forecast and plan. The biggest con, though, is that at times for new adopters, it can be somewhat overwhelming. Or for mature planning customers, it can be somewhat rigid, as I mentioned earlier. So what we tend to do is for our new adopters, we'll actually only roll out, again, two major features, the trending as well as the direct input. All our accelerators leverage ASO reporting. So we do not do any aggregation with any of our financials within any of our frameworks. So all the aggregation is managed through ASO reporting on the fly and using either smart pushes to the forms or for certain types of forms, we'll actually use Groovy to push directly into the ASO reporting cube. Okay. So for the 5 custom dimensions, a lot of our customers will go through and say, well, is that going to slow down performance? And the answer is no. And the reason why it's no, obviously with any dimension you add on, there's always the potential, right? But we only calculate what needs to be calculated in the planning models. They'll do any of the allocation logic if necessary. Obviously, that may require an aggregation. But we try to minimize the amount of aggregations as much as possible. Even doing some unique, references to the ASO reporting cubes to pull up totals. But then all the reporting, all the data gets pushed over to the reporting cube. So performance is fantastic, actually. And that's one of the things that Oracle has done a fantastic job of doing, is providing those ASO reporting cubes to give clients as well as partners the flexibility to leverage them for reporting purposes. Okay. From a detail perspective, obviously Essbase sits underneath. So, I mean, we've dealt with models that have upwards of a million members or more. So, and because of the fact that we leverage Groovy to only calculate what needs to be calculated in the model, performance is actually quite amazing when it comes to leveraging both the frameworks and the custom plan types for heavy lifting of planning processes. Bill, next slide. Yeah. From a workforce perspective, we actually implement a number of flavors of workforce within our accelerators. We love leveraging the workforce framework because it keeps our custom BSO plan types available for other applications or other processes. If it's a Netsuite customer, obviously we have to use a custom plan type unless they purchase EPBCS Premium. But for our Oracle customers that implement or use Enterprise Suite, we will use a workforce framework. Now, obviously from a pros perspective, it's quite full featured. It has an amazing amount of features within that particular framework. Oracle has tried to hit every feature that every customer could possibly have within it. And that's also a con. So we'll go into that in just a second. Lots of out-of-the-box forms, lots of wizards that are available to you, lots of pre-configured rules. Those rules are extremely locked down, so it's very difficult to go in and modify those rules unless you have a consultant that actually understands what's going on behind the scenes. From a cons perspective, as I mentioned, full features, a very full featured. It's extremely overwhelming, also a bit slow. I'm sure Oracle is going through and reworking the calculations to try to make them faster. But one of the biggest complaints from some of our clients is that, it takes a long time at times to just turn around one change within a form. At times you'll see the thing spinning 20 or 30 seconds. Again, Oracle is working to get that fixed, I'm sure. One of the biggest cons, and this is where our accelerators, that's one of the reasons why we've implemented our accelerators, is that they don't quite fit within the typical payroll system approach, where you're dealing with hire dates and term dates and physical dates. When is that employee physically hired within the month? Do they have lags when it comes to when benefits will hit based upon their specific anniversary date? When are they terminated? Are they terminated in the middle of the month? Oracle has made a decision not to roll with that approach, where they're dealing with physical calendar dates, and that's obviously Oracle's prerogative. They want to try to keep things "quote unquote" simple, but what we've tried to do within our accelerators is make that a bit more flexible, but we still leverage the framework. And the beauty of leveraging that framework is it uses that out-of-the-box plan type and therefore keeps the other plan types available. Okay, Bill?
Yep.
Now, in regards to projects, out of all all the plan types, I have to admit, I really like projects in regards to the amount of features that that team has put into that particular framework. It's extremely all-encompassing. So from a pros perspective, if a customer needs all those features, it's there, and it demos quite well. We've implemented flavors of projects through a number of our customers. And the beauty of projects is that it also integrates well with all the other frameworks in regards to workforce, and capital, and financials. So the big pro is also the biggest con. And at times when some customers have been demonstrated projects, they've gotten overwhelmed with all the feature and functionality that's in there. So what we do is we actually really trim it down. We put certain guardrails within that particular framework, because at the end of the day, I personally don't feel that all customers need all those features and functions. They're trying to go through and they're trying to plan or forecast for either existing or future projects, and they have a certain approach to handling that. So we try to stay within those particular guardrails, and our customers tend to be quite happy with that.
Sometimes, Jerry, we just use a custom plan type, right, rather than the projects.
Yeah, so depending on our clients, for example, on the Netsuite side, they don't get projects. So we implement a trimmed down version of a custom plan type when it comes to projects. And oddly enough, our customers like that trimmed down version of projects that's in its own custom plan type versus what comes through the project framework. And the reason why projects, and this is the biggest con within projects, is that it only comes with one custom dimension. Even going through and leveraging Smart List and ASO for reporting, so that we can bring those custom dimensions in there, it's still a little rigid. Okay, so basically, at the end of the day, understand your frameworks, understand some of the features that come within, and also some of the rigidness that may come with that particular framework. Mm-hmm. And feel free to not have to use that framework if necessary. Create your own custom framework. You may find that it may be less to implement that custom than to go in and have to highly customize a more rigid framework, for example, projects.
Yeah, and if you have a question later on, not today, but another day, and you're wondering if your requirement fits one of these frameworks or not, and just, you can ping us on LinkedIn, or our emails are on here, and we'll give you our thoughts at least, so you can take and do what as you wish. Thank you, Jerry. Groovy, a heavy use of Groovy. We use Groovy quite a bit, maybe not heavy, but quite a bit. So some of the things we do, one is when on larger forms, on smaller forms, not so much, but on larger forms, we look at what has been changed in the form, and then we run a calc specifically for those cells. Okay, so that could be orders of magnitude faster for some things, right? Jerry, I think we've seen really big impact to some of our clients, right?
Yeah, it's a massive impact. I mean, you have to also understand that the only time that we use Groovy is if we have to do something or deviate from the natural smart push that comes out of the forms. Because obviously Oracle's done a great job of improving the performance of smart push through forms, where it's only pushing specific changes, okay? But it's still, when you really need a highly customized push, and you're incorporating that with business rule logic that needs to be run prior, this is where this actually tends to shine.
And then we also use Groovy to do automation. So again, I mentioned John Goodwin had a great post about using HTTP REST APIs via Groovy rules. Kyle Griffin has a great blog, Selvin Katakuran. there's some really great resources out there. And so the way that we have used it is, since we were able to, he showed how to connect to REST API. What we've done is, using a Groovy rule, we're able to get substitution variables. We're able to set new ones. We're able to run DMS jobs, multiple GMS jobs. And the cool thing is, if you get a subvar, like let's say August 19 or August 20, you can use that subvar to run the DMS rules. So instead of having to go into DMS and changing the location, right, you can just change the substitution variable and then run any number of DMS jobs. So in the last client I had, like 15 or 20. You can run just about anything the REST API has. The only thing that could be kind of goofy is if you want to do a dimension update, right? So one sort of recommendation that's not on here is, when you run a Groovy rule to do any of these REST API things, run it on a plan type that's not your main plan type, like on a financials or workforce. If you have some other plan type that's not used very much, because a Groovy rule can run from anywhere. Okay, and this has been really amazing for our clients. They can just run the rule or have it be automated, and it can run across all of the plan types. It can do just about everything REST API does. You can do a lot of your automation right from the cloud rather than having to run it through EPM Automate. So this is huge, been huge for us. And if you want to know more, certainly we can talk to you about it. And we'll probably do a presentation on this at some upcoming conference. Some performance tips. We're running over. Danielle, should we wrap it up?
You're okay. If you guys, I don't know how many more slides you guys have, but yeah, we built in those breaks, so you're good to continue here.
Like 5 more slides.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so real quick, performance tips. We can talk about this for hours, right? We have tons of presentations across the community about these. Just going to mention a few things that you may already know about. If you have large firms, of course, use Groovy rules so that your amount of processing is low. Leverage ASO, as we've talked about, with smart pushes and data maps. If you didn't know, a smart push can be run from a form, not only a business rule, but a smart push. And in that configuration, you can override certain things. So like if on your form you have 4 scenarios and you hit save and it says, puts the pop-up box. Well, instead of that pop-up box, you can have an override if you want to just push one of those scenarios, right? And that could also be a way you limit the data that's pushed. So the more you limit, of course, the faster it's going to be. A lot of our clients, a lot of those forms, you can't even tell it's pushing data to ASO, right? So fast. Use your own rules for speed. The last one, be very careful, especially in BSO, of unnecessary aggregations. You have, a never shared rolling up to another never shared, but it's a single member roll up, and it's the top of the dimension. You're doubling your data for no reason. Okay, so be careful about that. The usual Essbase things, when you run a calc, try to look at one block once. Don't try to go over it many times. Right? Use, smart block creation techniques. There's tons of information about that. More cache is not always better, and a lot of times less cache is better. So when you do your settings, set it lower than you normally think. You might get a better result. Don't forget about fixed parallel, not just fix in your business rules. Right? Security, less is more. If you only need department security, well then forget about accounts, right? Don't do it. The more you apply, the slower it will render, right? Especially on-prem, we have a big issue about when you log in, it would take a while if you had a lot of security. This one you may not have known about. We found that most people haven't seen this before, but in cloud, you can rename just about anything in your application. So in your tools, I believe, or your application, there's something called artifact labels. And when you go in there, it has a filter and you click on that and it looks like there's nothing to it. And if you went in there, it's like, well, there's no functionality here. It's just maybe it's something to view settings. But if you select, for example, from a long list of dropdowns, there's tasks and tabs and clusters and cards. You select a property, and then when you apply it, you would then apply a language. So the one that you typically use, right? Once you do that, You can rename forms, you can rename menu items, just about anything in the application. So we've had really highly customized applications that look like what the user is expecting. So highly recommend using artifact labels.
Just one point to add on that one is that the reason why that's there is that a lot of the frameworks, a lot of our clients go through and try to rename a particular cluster or card, and they find out, oh, it's locked down, I can't do that. That's where these artifact labels come into play. This is where it gives you the ability to customize those frameworks to your own naming conventions. Bill.
All right. Again, tips that we all sort of know about. On a form, you might have a hidden column with actuals for last year, for example, to show what, and you have suppression on, so it shows you the combinations that actually have data, and that can really limit and be a nice presentation for users. You can put in formula rows or columns to create spaces to make it nicer to look at a form, right? You can use form validation rules and have some color coding, which is really nice. User variables we've talked about before, but to keep a good experience across unique areas in the application. And to tie that all together, navigation flows in cloud are really nice. You can customize your clusters and cards, what goes where. You can mix and match between the different forms and put them in different categories. Really recommend using your own navigation flow so that the application is really tightly organized.
You also have to remember that navigation flows are also tied by security. So you can have a unique navigation flow based upon role in the organization as well.
All right, and the last one is backup a design element? On-premise, really hard. I mean, LCM was great, but on cloud is really amazing, right? You can export your application and re-import it in case when something went wrong. Just a quick tip: in your application overview, there's a right click and gives you, or there's an actions button that gives you the export data option. This is really great. You get a data file, you can look at it in Notepad++, you can edit it, you can import it back. So I would do both those two things to sleep well at night. Okay. All right. Danielle, that's all we got. We can do Q&A.
Perfect. And I'm happy to read the ones. It looks like 2 came through the Q&A box. Yeah. If you can't open that, but just let me know.
Let's see. I am Zoom challenged. Oh, it's hiding behind. Okay. First question, is the EPBCS version on your slide the enterprise version or the standard version? Gerry?
So actually, as I mentioned in a prior slide, there are 3 flavors of EPBCS depending on which organization within Oracle is selling you that particular solution. So from an EPBCS perspective, anything that has to do with Groovy is actually enterprise, right? So EPBCS standard does not give you the ability to modify any Groovy. Obviously, it comes with Groovy rules, but those are kind of hidden and not available to you to manipulate. You can create any number of regular business rules or calc manager rules. So I guess your question here is anything that we referenced for EPBCS that was Groovy specific would have been enterprise, okay? And then on the NetSuite side, it would have been PBCS Plus or EPBCS Premium because it's
and the second question is, we have both the framework and custom designs. With the framework, we have seen an increase in time of data copies from one scenario to the other, for example, actuals or forecast. The custom environment is less than a minute for the same copy, but when they have a framework, it takes 2 hours. Why would that be potentially?
We haven't seen that. Okay, so on our financials framework, depending on which framework, I don't know what framework you implemented, right? So it would be interesting to see what framework you implemented, and also are you using the out-of-the-box business rules? Without going through and this is not a slam against our brethren on the Oracle side. We have noticed that some of the business rules tend to, due to the fact that they're quite all encompassing, and they're trying to make sure that they hit every particular requirement for our customers, they tend to be slower, okay? So we'll create custom business rules to do those data copies just to make sure that they're very targeted on exactly what the customer is trying to do. But in answer to that particular question, I haven't seen a 2-hour data copy from scenario to scenario.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors there, right? All right, I think that's all we got. Danielle, thanks for letting us go over.